In the vast emptiness of the Arizona desert, where the sun beats down mercilessly and the wind whispers secrets through ancient canyons, a lone cowboy named Jake Morrison sought nothing more than solitude and a fresh start. After years of drifting from ranch to ranch, he finally purchased his own piece of land, a forgotten property where the previous owner had mysteriously vanished decades ago. But on his third night at the ranch, as he stood beneath a blanket of stars, Jake felt the ground tremble beneath his boots. What he discovered the next morning, half buried in the sand behind his barn, would shatter everything he thought he knew about the universe. A metallic surface gleaming in the sunlight. Strange symbols etched into metal that seemed to shift and change when touched. And the door sealed shut for who knows how long, waiting to be opened. This is the story of a man who came to the desert looking for peace, but instead found himself at the center of humanity's greatest mystery. What lies within that buried ship? And why was it hidden on his land? Jake Morrison had always been a man of few words and even fewer attachments. At 42 years old, his weathered face told stories of countless sunrises on horseback, endless nights under open skies, and a life spent in the company of cattle and dust rather than people. When he finally scraped together enough money to buy the old Henderson Rancha, rundown property that had sat abandoned for 30 years, he didn't see the crumbling structures or the overgrown pastures. He saw freedom. He saw a place where no one would ask about his past, where he could rebuild something with his own two hands. The ranch sat 60 miles from the nearest town, accessible only by a dirt road that disappeared into the horizon. The main house was a weathered wooden structure with a sagging porch, but it was solid enough. The barn needed work, but Jake had time. What mattered most was the silence, the kind of profound quiet that only exists in the deepest parts of the desert, where civilization feels like a distant memory. On his first day, Jake unloaded his truck, which carried everything he owned: tools, clothes, a few books, and his grandfather's rifle. He spent the afternoon repairing the water pump and clearing tumbleweeds from the porch. As the sun set, painting the desert in shades of orange and purple, he sat on the steps with a cup of coffee and allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. This was his. Finally, something that belonged to him alone. But that night, something strange happened. Jake woke around 3 in the morning to an odd sensation, a low-frequency vibration that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. It wasn't an earthquake. He'd felt those before. This was different, more controlled, almost rhythmic. He sat up in bed, listening, but after a few minutes, the sensation stopped. He convinced himself it was just the old house settling or perhaps underground water movement. The desert was full of mysteries, after all. The next morning, Jake began surveying his property more thoroughly. The ranch covered 200 acres of scrubland, dotted with mesquite and the occasional Joshua tree. Behind the barn, where the land sloped gently downward into a shallow basin, he noticed something peculiar. The sand in this area had a strange texture, almost glassy in places, as if it had been exposed to intense heat. Dark patches of earth formed an irregular circle, about 50 feet in diameter. As Jake walked across this area, he felt that vibration again, stronger now, resonating through his boots. He knelt down and brushed away some sand with his hand, revealing something that made his heart skip. Metal. Not rusted iron or old machinery, but smooth, silvery metal that seemed to shimmer with an inner light. He dug faster, his hands working frantically, and within minutes he had uncovered a curved surface about 10 feet long, covered in intricate patterns that looked almost like circuitry, but far more complex. Jake sat back on his heels, his mind racing. This wasn't part of any building. It wasn't a buried tank or forgotten equipment. The craftsmanship was unlike anything he'd ever seen. The metal was perfectly smooth, without seams or welds, as if the entire piece had been formed in one continuous flow. And those patterns, they seemed to pulse very faintly, as if energy still ran through them after all these years. He spent the rest of that day uncovering more of the structure, working until his hands were raw and his back ached. By sunset, he had revealed what appeared to be part of a massive curved hull, buried at a 45-degree angle in the sand. The thing had to be at least 100 feet long, maybe more. And as the last light of day struck the metal surface, Jake saw something that made his blood run cold. Symbols. Rows and rows of symbols that definitely weren't English, Spanish, or any language he'd ever encountered. They seemed to glow faintly in the twilight, casting an eerie blue-green light across the sand. Jake barely slept that night. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, his mind spinning with impossible questions. What was that thing buried on his property? How long had it been there? The Henderson family had owned this land for generations before mysteriously abandoning it in the 1990s. Had they known? Was that why they left? At dawn, Jake was back at the site with proper excavation tools, shovels, pickaxes, and a determination that bordered on obsession. He needed to know what this was. The rational part of his brain suggested it could be some kind of experimental military aircraft from the Cold War era. The area wasn't far from various government testing ranges. But the design, the materials, the symbols, none of it fit that explanation. As he dug, Jake began to notice other anomalies. The sand around the buried object had a strange consistency, and small pieces of what looked like black glass were scattered throughout the area. His shovel occasionally struck patches of melted rock, fused into irregular shapes by what must have been extraordinary heat. Whatever had happened here, it had been catastrophic. By mid-morning, Jake had exposed what appeared to be a sealed hatch or doorway. It was roughly circular, about 8 feet in diameter, and completely smooth except for a depression in the center that looked like a handprint, but with 6 fingers instead of 5. The sight of it made Jake's hands tremble. This wasn't military. This wasn't from any government he knew. His mind rebelled against the obvious conclusion, but the evidence was literally in front of him, buried in the sand. He tried everything to open it. He pried with crowbars, hammered around the edges, even attempted to drill into the metal, but nothing worked. The material was impossibly hard, absorbing impacts without a scratch. As the afternoon heat grew unbearable, Jake sat in the shadow of his barn, staring at his discovery and trying to decide what to do next. The rational choice would be to call the authorities, report it. Let scientists and government officials take over. But Jake had lived long enough on the margins of society to know how that would go. They'd seal off his property, take everything, and he'd lose the only thing he'd ever truly owned. Besides, something deeper kept him from making that call a fierce, almost primal need to understand this mystery himself before anyone else could interfere. That evening, as Jake sat on the partially exposed hull watching the sunset, something extraordinary happened. As the last rays of sunlight struck the metal surface, the symbols began to glow more brightly. The pulsing pattern increased in frequency, and suddenly, a holographic projection erupted from the center of the hatch, a 3-dimensional star map showing constellations he recognized, and others he didn't hunt. Lines of light connected various stars, forming what looked like a route or journey. And at the center of the projection was a small blue sphere that looked unmistakably like Earth. Jake stumbled backward, his heart pounding. The projection lasted only a few seconds before fading, but the implications were staggering. This wasn't just a crashed object, it was a ship. A vessel that had traveled between stars, crossed unimaginable distances, and ended up buried beneath the property of a lonely cowboy in the Arizona desert. As darkness fell, Jake made a decision. He would document everything meticulously. He would study this ship, learn from it, and only then would he decide what to do with his discovery. He went back to the house and retrieved his grandfather's old Polaroid camera and a notebook. He would treat this like any other ranch project, methodically, carefully, and on his own terms. But as Jake photographed the symbols and sketched the patterns in his notebook, He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Several times he turned quickly, expecting to see someone behind him, but found only empty desert stretching to the horizon. The wind carried strange sounds, metallic whispers and distant hums that might have been his imagination or might have been something else entirely. The ship, it seemed, was not quite as dormant as he had hoped. 3 days after discovering the hatch, Jake woke to find that something had changed. The ship was no longer completely silent. A low, almost subliminal hum emanated from beneath the sand, and when he approached the exposed section, he could feel warmth radiating from the metal, not hot enough to burn, but distinctly warmer than the surrounding earth. The symbols were glowing continuously now, no longer requiring sunlight to activate them. Jake's initial excitement had evolved into something more complex, a mixture of awe, fear, and an overwhelming sense of responsibility. He had barely told anyone about buying this ranch, and now he possessed potentially the most significant discovery in human history. The isolation he'd sought had become a different kind of burden entirely. On the morning of the 4th day, Jake was preparing his excavation equipment when he heard the unmistakable sound of an engine in the distance. A vehicle was approaching his property. Panic gripped him. He quickly threw tarps over the exposed sections of the ship and kicked sand over the obvious dig areas. By the time a dusty pickup truck pulled up to his house, Jake had composed himself enough to walk out and greet the visitor with a casual wave. The driver was a woman in her mid-50s with sun-weathered skin and sharp, intelligent eyes. She introduced herself as Sarah Chun, a geologist from the university who was conducting a survey of unusual mineral formations in the area. She'd seen his truck tracks leading off the main road and stopped to introduce herself to the new neighbor. Jake's mouth went dry as she explained that this particular region had some interesting geological anomalies unexplained, heat signatures and magnetic variations that had puzzled researchers for years. As they talked, Jake struggled to maintain his composure. Sarah seemed friendly enough, but her casual mention of magnetic anomalies felt too coincidental. Was she really here by chance, or did someone know what he'd found? When she asked to take some soil samples from his property for her research, Jake politely declined, claiming he needed to get the ranch in order before allowing any scientific work. Sarah accepted his refusal graciously, but handed him her card before leaving. "If you notice anything unusual," she said with an odd emphasis on the word unusual, "please don't hesitate to call." After she left, Jake stood in his driveway for a long time, watching the dust from her truck settle back to earth. The encounter had rattled him. How much did she actually know? Were there others watching his property? The paranoia that had once seemed ridiculous now felt entirely justified. That night, everything changed. Jake was awakened not by vibrations, but by light, a brilliant blue-green glow seeping through his bedroom window. He rushed outside to find the entire buried ship illuminated, its energy systems apparently coming back to life after decades or centuries of dormancy. The hatch was now clearly visible, outlined in pulsing light, and as Jake approached, it began to open. The seal broke with a hiss of escaping atmosphere, and the circular door rotated slowly inward. Jake stood frozen, his grandfather's rifle gripped uselessly in shaking hands. Cool air washed over him from inside the ship, carrying a strange metallic scent mixed with something organic and unfamiliar. The interior was dark, except for scattered points of light that might have been indicator panels or something else entirely. Every instinct screamed at Jake to run, to get in his truck and drive until this was someone else's problem. But curiosity and wonder overwhelmed his fear. He retrieved a flashlight from his barn and, with his heart hammering against his ribs, stepped through the hatch and into the alien vessel. The floor was solid beneath his feet, and as he moved forward, emergency lighting flickered to life along the corridor, revealing a passageway that curved gently downward into the heart of the ship. The interior was remarkably preserved. The walls were smooth and organic looking, more grown than built, with that same circuit-like pattern embedded throughout. Jake moved carefully, documenting everything with his camera, his hands trembling so badly that half the photos would be blurred. He passed what appeared to be storage compartments, their purposes mysterious, and rooms with furniture, if it could be called that, designed for bodies that weren't quite human-shaped. Then Jake reached what he assumed was the bridge or control center, and there, in a seat designed for something with a longer torso and more articulated limbs, he found the pilot, or what remained of it. The being's body had desiccated over the years, its features partially preserved by the ship's atmosphere. It was humanoid, but distinctly alien, taller than any human, with elongated limbs and a skull that was more angular. Its clothing had deteriorated, but fragments remained, showing materials and weaving techniques that no human had ever created. And clutched in its long-fingered hand was something that looked like a data device, a smooth crystalline object that began to glow when Jake approached. Jake stumbled backward from the pilot's chair, his breath coming in short gasps. He'd found proof, undeniable, tangible proof, that humans were not alone in the universe. The weight of this discovery crushed down on him. This wasn't his to keep quiet. This was humanity's story, not just his own. But as he stood in that alien control room, surrounded by technology beyond his comprehension, Jake also understood that revealing this discovery would mean losing everything. His ranch, his privacy, his life as he knew it would all disappear the moment he made that phone call. The crystal device in the alien's hand continued to glow, and Jake felt compelled to take it. As his fingers closed around the smooth surface, the object suddenly activated, and images flooded directly into his mind, not through his eyes, but somehow deeper, as if the information was being written directly onto his consciousness. He saw the ship traveling through space, witnessed other worlds with purple skies and double suns, observed cities of impossible architecture built by beings of a dozen different forms. And he felt the pilot's last moments, the panic as the ship malfunctioned, the desperate attempt to control the descent, and the crash that buried the vessel beneath the desert sand over 200 years ago, long before this land was officially settled by anyone. When the vision stopped, Jake found himself on his knees, tears streaming down his face. The pilot had a name, something that translated roughly as Keeper of Stories, and had been a scientist, an explorer documenting life across the galaxy. The crash had been an accident, a failure of systems the pilot couldn't repair alone. And in those final moments, the alien had activated a beacon, a distress signal that had been broadcasting for 2 centuries, hoping for rescue that never came. Jake spent the next several days in a daze, moving between his house and the ship, trying to process what he'd learned. The crystal device had given him access to some of the ship's systems. He could now read the symbols, understand the basic layout, and even access some of the archived data. The ship's library contained information about dozens of worlds, hundreds of species, and technologies that could transform human civilization overnight. Medicine that could cure diseases humanity hadn't even discovered yet. Energy systems that required no fuel. Methods of food production that could end hunger. It was all there, waiting. But Jake also found something troubling in the ship's logs. The pilot had noted detecting other signals from Earth signs that humans were being watched, studied. The Keeper of Stories mission had included observing human development, documenting the species' growth, and reporting back to some kind of galactic collective. Earth, it seemed, was considered a protected world, one not yet ready for contact. The crash had been an accident, but it had violated protocols, and the pilot had spent years trying to repair the ship before eventually succumbing to injuries and isolation. This revelation changed everything. If Jake revealed the ship, humanity would learn it was being observed. Governments would panic. Religious institutions would fracture. The entire social order might collapse under the weight of such knowledge. Was he prepared to trigger that kind of upheaval? Did he have the right to make that choice for everyone? His decision was made for him on the 10th day after opening the hatch. Jake woke to the sound of helicopters. He rushed outside to see 3 military choppers circling his property, and within minutes, a convoy of black vehicles was racing down his dirt road. Agents in dark suits and military uniforms poured onto his land, weapons drawn, securing the perimeter with frightening efficiency. A man in his 60s, wearing a general's uniform, approached Jake with a mixture of sympathy and stern authority. "Mr. Morrison," he said, "we need to talk about what you found on your property. They've been monitoring the beacon signal for decades, apparently triangulating its position but never quite pinpointing it until Jake S. excavation activated the ship S systems more fully. They'd known something was buried out here. They just hadn't known exactly where until he'd shown them." Jake was escorted to his own kitchen table while teams of specialists descended on the ship. Through his window, he watched them document everything, photograph everything, take everything. The general, whose name was Patterson, explained that this was a matter of national security, global security, actually. The government had been aware of extraterrestrial visits for decades, managing the information carefully to prevent panic. Jake's discovery was just one of several such sites around the world, all carefully monitored and contained. "You did the right thing by not calling anyone immediately," Patterson said, which struck Jake as ironic since he'd had no intention of calling anyone at all. "This information needs to be managed properly, revealed slowly, carefully. Humanity isn't ready for full disclosure yet. Perhaps someday, but not now." The implication was clear. Jake would need to stay quiet. Compensation would be generous. They'd buy his ranch for 10 times what he'd paid, relocate him wherever he wanted, ensure his silence through a combination of rewards and barely veiled threats. But Jake thought about the keeper of stories, about an explorer who died alone and far from home, waiting for rescue that never came. He thought about the crystal device he'd hidden in his boot, the one piece of the ship the soldiers hadn't found. And he thought about humanity's right to know the truth about its place in the universe. Jake's life became a carefully controlled nightmare. He was relocated to a government facility in Nevada, where he spent weeks being debriefed by scientists, military officials, and intelligence agents. They wanted to know everything he'd seen, every detail of his time inside the ship, every piece of information the crystal device had shown him. Jake told them most of it but held back the most crucial details, particularly about the galactic collective and humanity S status as a protected, observed species. Some truths, he'd decided, needed to be shared on his own terms. The facility was comfortable enough, more like a hotel than a prison, but Jake remained acutely aware that he wasn't free to leave. His every movement was monitored, his phone calls screened, his requests filtered through handlers who smiled politely while denying him any real autonomy. They assured him repeatedly that this was temporary, that once they'd secured everything from the ship, he'd be released to start his new life with enough money to ensure his comfortable silence. But Jake saw the truth in the eyes of the scientists who interviewed him. This discovery was too big, too important. They would never truly let him go. He'd become a piece of the secret, something to be managed and controlled indefinitely. The realization filled him with a cold, calculated fury that he'd never experienced before. He'd spent his whole life staying out of other people's business, maintaining his independence at all costs. And now, because he'd dug in his own damn yard, he'd become a prisoner. The crystal device remained hidden in a concealed pocket he'd sewn into his boot, his one advantage in this situation. Every night, while the guards assumed he was sleeping, Jake would activate the device and study the information it contained. He learned how to access the ship's deeper systems, discovered protocols and commands that even the government scientists hadn't found yet. And he learned something that changed everything. The ship's beacon could be repurposed. Instead of sending a simple distress signal, it could broadcast data across space. It could send the ship's entire library, all its accumulated knowledge, anywhere Jake directed it. On his 43rd night in the facility, Jake made his move. He'd been working on a guard named Martinez, a young man who de-joined the military to pay for college and seemed increasingly uncomfortable with the secrecy surrounding Jake as detention. Jake had shared his story carefully, planting seeds of doubt about whether the government had the right to hide this discovery from humanity. When Jake finally asked Martinez to smuggle him a phone with internet access for just 1 hour, the guard agreed. What Jake did with that hour would change human history. Using the crystal device and the phone, he accessed the ship as remote systems. The scientists had moved it to a secure location in the Nevada desert, but they hadn't realized the pilot could control it from anywhere on the planet. Jake activated the beacon and reprogrammed it with commands he'd learned from the crystal. Then he uploaded everything: the complete library, the pilot's logs, the evidence of extraterrestrial life, the technology, the medicine, everything, to a data haven on the internet distributed across 1,000 servers in countries around the world impossible to fully suppress or delete. Then, Jake published the access codes on every major social media platform, scientific forum, and news website he could reach. Within minutes, before the facility's security could stop the transmission, the information had spread beyond any possibility of containment. Scientists in Mumbai were accessing alien medical technology. Students in Sao Paulo were studying propulsion systems. Researchers in Stockholm were translating the pilot's personal journals. The secret was out, spreading faster than any government could suppress it. The facility erupted in chaos. Alarms blared. Agents rushed into Jake's room, and General Patterson arrived within the hour, his face a mask of controlled rage. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he demanded. "The panic this will cause? The upheaval?" But Jake stood his ground. "I've given humanity what it deserves: the truth. We're not children who need to be protected from reality. We're survivors, and we have a right to know we're not alone." He explained about the Galactic Collective, about humanity being observed and studied like specimens in a lab. "We've been living in a cage we didn't even know existed. Now, at least, we can see the bars." Patterson slumped into a chair, suddenly looking every one of his 60-plus years. "You've started something that can't be stopped," he said quietly. "The world will never be the same. Within days, governments will fall. Within weeks, everything we know about human society will be in question. I hope you're ready for what comes next, because you've just made yourself the most famous and most endangered person on the planet." Outside the window of Jake's room, the Nevada desert stretched into darkness, the same kind of empty landscape where he'd once sought peace and solitude. But that simple life was gone forever, burned away by the light of truth he'd released into the world. The weeks following Jake's revelation unfolded in waves of chaos, wonder, and transformation that rippled across the globe. Within 48 hours of the data release, every major government held emergency sessions. The United Nations convened a special assembly that would run continuously for months. Religious leaders grappled with integrating the existence of extraterrestrial life into their theologies. Scientists abandoned their previous research to study the wealth of knowledge now freely available to anyone with an internet connection. Jake became a global figure, simultaneously hailed as a hero and condemned as a reckless vigilante. He was released from government custody. Holding him had become impossible once his face was known worldwide. But his life bore little resemblance to anything he'd known before. He gave testimony before Congress, the UN, and scientific bodies around the world. He refused payment for interviews, donated the government's hush money to educational programs, and spent his days helping coordinate the global effort to understand and responsibly implement the alien technology. The social upheaval Patterson had predicted did occur, but not in the catastrophic way he'd feared. Yes, 3 governments fell in the immediate aftermath, unable to explain decades of secrecy to betrayed populations. Yes, religious institutions struggled, and some fractured over theological implications. Yes, there were riots and protests and confusion, but there was also unprecedented cooperation. Nations that had been enemies for generations found common cause in studying the revelations. Scientists collaborated across borders with a freedom and enthusiasm that had never existed before. Humanity, confronted with evidence of its cosmic insignificance, somehow found ways to come together rather than tear itself apart. The medical breakthroughs came first. Within 6 months, diseases that had plagued humanity for millennia were curable. Cancer, Alzheimer's, genetic disorders all became manageable conditions rather than death sentences. The alien technology was surprisingly adaptable to human physiology, and medical researchers worked tirelessly to translate the archives into practical treatments. Energy and environmental technologies followed. The ship's power systems, once understood, offered a blueprint for clean, inexhaustible energy generation. Within a year, the first fusion reactors based on alien principles came online, and the world began a rapid transition away from fossil fuels. Climate scientists, armed with the alien data on atmospheric management, began implementing strategies to reverse environmental damage that had seemed irreversible. But the most profound changes were psychological and social. Humanity had proof it was being watched by a larger galactic community. The protocols in the ship's database suggested that when a species reached certain technological and social thresholds, they were contacted and invited to join the collective. Humanity was close, perhaps only decades away from meeting those criteria. This knowledge created a new global purpose, a common goal that transcended national, racial, and religious boundaries. People began to see themselves not primarily as Americans or Brazilian, but as humans working toward a shared destiny among the stars. Jake himself struggled with his new role. He'd never wanted fame or responsibility. He'd bought that ranch to escape the demands of society, not to become its most visible spokesman for humanity's cosmic future. But as he traveled the world, speaking to audiences about what he'd found, he began to see his discovery differently. He wasn't the story. The keeper of stories was. That alien explorer who died alone and far from home had inadvertently given humanity the greatest gift imaginable: perspective. 2 years after his initial discovery, Jake attended a ceremony at the site where the ship had been buried. The vessel itself had been transported to an international research facility, but the location had been preserved as a memorial, not just to the crash, but to humanity's awakening. A monument had been erected there, a simple stone marker with the alien pilot's name translated into every human language, along with a dedication to the keeper of stories whose accidental visit ended our cosmic loneliness, and to Jake Morrison, who ensured the truth would prevail over fear. Standing before that monument with Sarah Chun, the geologist who'd visited his ranch that fateful day, and who he later learned was part of a network of scientists who suspected the truth beside him, Jake felt a complex mixture of emotions. Pride, certainly. Relief that the chaos had given way to progress. But also grief for the life he'd lost, and the simple dream that had brought him to that desert ranch. "Do you regret it?" Sarah asked, reading his expression. They'd become close over the past 2 years, united by their roles in humanity's great transition. "Do you wish you'd just filled in the hole and walked away?" Jake watched the sunset paint the Arizona desert in familiar colors, thought about the cowboy he'd been and the symbol he'd become, and slowly shook his head. "I wanted to escape the world," he said quietly. "Instead, I helped change it. That's not what I planned, but maybe it's what I was meant to do." He paused, then added with a slight smile, "Though I do miss the quiet sometimes." Above them, the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Stars that humans now knew were surrounded by worlds teeming with life. Stars that represented not empty space, but a community humanity was preparing to join. Jake Morrison, the lonely cowboy who'd sought nothing more than a piece of land to call his own, had given his species the universe. It wasn't the life he'd wanted, but as he stood there watching the cosmos reveal itself, he understood it was exactly the life humanity had needed him to live. The desert still whispered its secrets through the canyons, but now those whispers carried the promise of voices from distant worlds, reaching across the darkness to welcome Earth's children home.